At 10:36 p.m. on October 24, 1944, Lieutenant John McElfresh stood on the bridge of PT-137, a 80-foot plywood torpedo boat, displacing 56 tons, watching his radar screen display contacts that shouldn't exist. The radar showed two massive targets approximately 18,000 yards distant, moving north through Surigao Strait toward the American landing beaches at Leyte Gulf. The radar returns indicated vessels far larger than any Japanese ship's intelligence had predicted in this area. McElfresh's radar operator, Torpedo Man Second Class Robert Thompson, said, "Sir, those contacts are huge, battleship-sized, maybe bigger. There's two of them, plus smaller contacts that look like cruisers and destroyers. I'm counting at least 14 ships total." McElfresh calculated the odds confronting him. His PT boat carried four 21-inch torpedoes, two 50-caliber machine guns, and a crew of 12. The boat's plywood hull offered zero protection against anything larger than rifle-caliber weapons. Maximum speed was 41 knots, the only advantage his boat had against the approaching Japanese force. The radar contacts, if they were battleships as Thompson suggested, displaced approximately 30,000 tons each, carried armor up to 14 inches thick, and mounted 12 14-inch guns capable of firing 1,400-pound shells to ranges exceeding 20 miles. Each battleship weighed approximately 535 times more than McElfresh's torpedo boat. Standard PT boat doctrine said, attack from darkness, use speed and surprise, fire torpedoes from approximately 1,000 yards range, then escape at maximum speed before the enemy could respond. But the doctrine assumed attacking individual cargo ships or destroyers, not formations of battleships escorted by cruisers and destroyers that would fill the strait with defensive fire. McElfresh commanded one of 7 PT boats positioned in Surigao Strait to provide early warning and harassment attacks against any Japanese forces attempting to reach the American landing beaches. The 7 boats totaled 392 tons combined displacement, carrying 28 torpedoes total. They were about to engage 170,000 tons of Japanese steel, carrying approximately 150 major caliber guns. Physics said this was suicide. Doctrine said retreat and report. Every rational calculation said 7 plywood boats couldn't meaningfully damage or delay a battleship force. McElfresh ordered, "All boats attack, we're going in." Over the next 2 hours, the 7 PT boats conducted 23 separate torpedo attacks against the Japanese southern force, dodging shells from battleship main batteries, cruiser secondary guns, and destroyer anti-aircraft weapons while trying to close within torpedo range. The boats were hammered by near misses, raked by machine gun fire, and illuminated by searchlights that exposed them to concentrated fire. One boat was sunk, 2 more were damaged so badly they could barely maneuver, and the others were riddled with holes from shell fragments. The torpedo attack scored 1. Confirmed hit on the battleship Fuso and possibly 2 hits on cruisers, negligible damage to a force that size. But the attacks delayed the Japanese advance by 47 minutes, forcing the formation to maneuver evasively and slow its approach speed. Those 47 minutes allowed American battleships and destroyers at the northern end of Surigao Strait to complete their battle preparations and position themselves for the ambush that would destroy the Japanese southern force in one of the most one-sided naval victories of the war. If you want to see how 7 PT boats attacked 4 battleships and 8 cruisers with nothing but plywood hulls and audacity, hit that like button. It helps us share these stories where tiny boats delayed dreadnoughts. Subscribe if you haven't already, because we're diving into the night when 392 tons of plywood engaged 170,000 tons of steel. Back to October 1944 and the largest naval battle in history. The Battle of Leyte Gulf, fought October 23-26, 1944, was the largest naval engagement in history, involving approximately 370 ships and 200,000 personnel across 4 separate major engagements spanning 100,000 square miles of ocean. The battle resulted from the American invasion of Leyte Island in the Philippines, which threatened to cut Japanese supply lines to Southeast Asia and isolate Japanese forces in the southern Pacific. The Japanese Navy committed virtually its entire remaining surface fleet, to a desperate operation aimed at destroying the American invasion forces and potentially turning the tide of the Pacific War. The Japanese plan, called Shogo 1, Victory Operation 1, involved 3 separate task forces converging on Leyte Gulf from different directions to catch American forces between multiple threats. The center force, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, approached from the northwest through San Bernardino Strait with 5 battleships, including the massive Yamato and Musashi, 12 cruisers, and 15 destroyers. The northern force, commanded by Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, approached from the north with 4 aircraft carriers, largely empty of aircraft, serving as decoys to draw American carrier forces away from Leyte Gulf. The southern force, commanded by Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, approached from the south through Surigao Strait with 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, and 4 destroyers. The Southern Force's mission was to transit Surigao Strait during darkness on October 24th, 25, emerge into Leyte Gulf at dawn on October 25th, and attack American amphibious shipping from the south, while the center force attacked from the west, and the northern force drew away American carrier-based air power. The plan required precise timing and coordination across hundreds of miles of ocean without radio communication to maintain surprise. It was an extremely high-risk operation with low probability of success, but Japanese command considered the strategic situation desperate enough to justify the risk. Vice Admiral Nishimura's southern force consisted of 2 Fuso-class battleships, Yamashiro, flagship, and Fuso, 1 Mogami-class heavy cruiser, Mogami, and 4 Shigure-class destroyers. The battleships, built in 1915-1917 and modernized in the 1930s, were obsolete by 1944 standards but still formidable. Each battleship displaced 35,900 tons fully loaded, carried 12 14-inch 45 caliber guns in 6 twin turrets, 14 6-inch secondary guns, 8 5-inch anti-aircraft guns, and numerous 25mm machine guns. Armor included 12-inch belt armor, 5-inch deck armor, and 14-inch turret face armor. Maximum speed, 24.7 knots, reduced to approximately 20 knots by age and lack of maintenance. The 14-inch guns fired 1,400-pound armor-piercing shells to maximum range of 38,170 yards, nearly 22 miles, though effective range against moving targets was much shorter. Rate of fire, approximately 1 round per gun every 40 seconds, meaning each battleship could fire approximately 18 rounds per minute from its main battery. The guns could depress to engage surface targets as close as 5,000 yards, though hitting small, fast-moving targets at close range was difficult with guns designed for long-range battleship engagements. The heavy cruiser Mogami displaced 13,670 tons and carried 10 8-inch guns, 8 5-inch anti-aircraft guns, and extensive machine gun armament. The 4 destroyers each displaced approximately 2,000 tons and carried 6 5-inch guns plus torpedoes. Total force displacement, approximately 104,000 tons, carrying approximately 150 major caliber guns, 12 14-inch, 10 8-inch, numerous 5-inch and 6-inch weapons. Additionally, Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima's 2nd Striking Force, following several hours behind Nishimura, added 2 heavy cruisers, 1 light cruiser, and 4 destroyers, total displacement approximately 33,000 tons. Combined Japanese forces approaching through Surigao Strait totaled approximately 137,000 tons, though Shima and Nishimura operated independently without coordination. Defending Surigao Strait, the U.S. 7th Fleet under Rear Admiral Jesse Oldendorf had positioned 6 battleships, 5 of them survivors of Pearl Harbor seeking revenge, 8 cruisers, 28 destroyers, and 39 PT boats in a layered defense designed to destroy any Japanese force attempting the strait transit. The PT boats, positioned in the southern approaches, were the first line of defense, tasked with providing early warning, launching torpedo attacks to damage or slow the enemy, and illuminating targets for follow-on destroyer attacks. Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3, consisting of 13 PT boats in 3 sections, patrolled the southern approaches to Surigao Strait. The boats, 80-foot Elco-type PT boats, were high-speed torpedo boats designed for hit-and-run attacks against shipping. Construction: wooden hull of plywood laminated in 3 layers, 2 layers of mahogany planking with waterproof adhesive between, supported by wooden frames, displacement, 56 tons fully loaded, length 80 feet, beam 20 feet 8 inches, draft 5 feet 3 inches, propulsion 3 Packard V12 gasoline engines producing 1,500 horsepower each, total 4,500 horsepower, driving 3 propellers, maximum speed 41 knots, approximately 47 miles per hour, light approximately 38 knots fully loaded, range 500 nautical miles at cruising speed. The boats were among the fastest naval vessels afloat, speed being their primary defense since the plywood hull offered no protection against anything except small arms fire. Armament: 4 Mark 8 21-inch torpedoes and roll-off racks, 2 twin 50 caliber machine gun turrets, 1 forward, 1 aft, sometimes supplemented with 20 mm, 37 mm cannons depending on individual boat modifications. The torpedoes were the boat's primary weapons, each carrying a 600-pound TNT warhead capable of sinking cruisers or damaging battleships if the hit was well placed. Torpedo range: approximately 12,000 yards at 27. Knots speed setting, though effective range against maneuvering targets was much shorter because torpedoes traveled in straight lines while targets could turn. The torpedo's major limitation was their speed. At 27 knots setting, a torpedo took approximately 6 minutes to travel 12,000 yards. A target moving at 20 knots could travel 4,000 yards in those 6 minutes, meaning torpedo attacks required estimating where the target would be several minutes after launch and aiming accordingly. PT boat doctrine emphasized attacking from short range, 1,000 to 2,000 yards, reducing torpedo runtime to 1 to 2 minutes and increasing hit probability. Crew: 12 men typically, though wartime operating procedures often reduced this to 9 or 10. The crew included boat captain, usually an officer, lieutenant junior grade or ensign, executive officer, 3 engine men, torpedo man, radio man, radar operator, gunners, and additional deck crew. Training emphasized high-speed maneuvering, night, operations, and coordinated attacks by multiple boats. On the night of October 24 to 25, 1944, PT Boat Section 3, PT 134, PT 137, PT 152, PT 191 was patrolling the southern entrance to Surigao Strait when radar detected the approaching Japanese force at approximately 10 p.m. The boats had been on patrol for 5 hours, cruising at economical speed to conserve fuel, maintaining radio silence, and monitoring radar for contacts. The Philippine Islands created a dark background behind them, while the open strait provided maneuver room. Lieutenant John McElfresh, commanding PT 137, was senior officer of Section 3. At 10:36 p.m., his radar operator reported multiple large contacts bearing south, range 18,000 yards, heading north toward the strait. McElfresh ordered his section to increase speed and close for identification. At 10:52 p.m., with range reduced to 12,000 yards, the radar returns clearly indicated multiple large warships in formation. McElfresh broke radio silence to report multiple large contacts, probable battleships with escort, heading north through Surigao Strait. AM preparing to attack. The tactical situation was challenging. The Japanese force was steaming north in column formation. Battleships Yamashiro and Fuso in center with cruiser Mogami and destroyers screening ahead and on flanks. The column occupied approximately 6,000 yards of ocean from lead destroyer to trailing battleship. The formation was moving at approximately 18 knots, slow enough to maintain formation cohesion in restricted waters. PT boat attack doctrine required approaching from the target's beam or quarter, firing torpedoes from 1,000 to 2,000 yards range perpendicular to the target's course, then escaping at maximum speed. Approaching from ahead or astern allowed targets to maneuver to avoid torpedoes by simply changing speed. Beam attacks, where torpedoes crossed the target's course at 90-degree angle, gave targets minimal warning and limited avoidance options. But the narrow, straight and Japanese formation made beam attacks difficult. The The Japanese column was steaming up the center of the strait, approximately 10,000 yards from either shore. PT boats on the flanks would need to cross 5,000 yards of open water to reach firing position, during which they would be exposed to Japanese radar detection and defensive fire. Once they fired torpedoes, escape would require high-speed run parallel to the Japanese column while under fire from multiple ships. McElfresh decided on a different approach: high-speed run directly at the Japanese formation from ahead, fire torpedoes at close range while passing the lead ships, then turn sharply and escape to the flank using speed and darkness. This violated standard doctrine, but offered better survival probability in the restricted waters. He ordered his section to form line abreast, spacing 500 yards between boats, and attack together to saturate Japanese defenses. At 11:07 p.m., the 4 PT boats accelerated to attack speed, 38 knots, engines roaring as the boats leaped onto plane, with bows rising and sterns settling. The 3 Packard engines in each boat, 4,500 horsepower total, pushed the plywood hulls through the water at speeds exceeding 40 miles per hour. The boats created massive wakes, white water visible for miles under the quarter moon, each boat trailing a phosphorescent wake that marked its position for any observer. Japanese radar detected them immediately. Aboard PT-137, the crew felt the familiar transition as the boat went on to plane, the hull rising out of the water and skipping across the surface rather than plowing through it. Quartermaster John Kovar, standing beside McElfresh on the bridge, gripped the windscreen as the boat bounced across wavetops, each impact jarring the entire structure. The plywood hull, while flexible enough to absorb some shock, transmitted every wave impact directly to the crew. Kovar later described, "At 38 knots in a PT boat, you're not riding in a boat. You're riding on a series of controlled crashes. Every wave hits like a hammer. Your knees take the impact, your spine compresses, your teeth rattle, you can't think about it or you'll freeze up." At range 8,000 yards, Japanese destroyers opened fire with 5-inch guns, the muzzle flashes visible as orange blooms in the darkness ahead. The shells, each weighing approximately 50 pounds, took approximately 12 seconds to travel 8,000 yards. The time delay between seeing the muzzle flash and hearing the shell impact gave PT boat crews a critical few seconds to react. The first salvo landed approximately 200 yards ahead of the formation, tall waterspouts erupting where shells impacted, the impacts creating thunderous sounds that carried across the water. McElfresh ordered evasive maneuvers, the 4 boats weaving in coordinated pattern that had been practiced but never executed under fire. Each boat captain made independent steering decisions while maintaining general formation cohesion. Though pattern involved random course changes every 20 to 30 seconds, never settling into predictable movement that Japanese gunners could anticipate. PT-137 jinked left, PT-134 right. PT-152 maintained course, while PT-191 executed a sharp S-turn. The Japanese gunners, attempting to track 4 small, fast targets executing independent maneuvers, struggled to achieve hits, but near misses were frequent and dangerous. At 11:09 p.m., a 5-inch shell landed approximately 30 yards from PT-134, the explosion throwing a column of water 40 feet into the air. The water descended on the boat like a waterfall, drenching the crew and momentarily obscuring visibility. Fragments from the shell casing, traveling at supersonic velocity, peppered the boat's port side, penetrating the thin plywood hull and wounding gunner's mate 3rd Class William Patterson in the leg. Patterson, manning the forward .50 caliber turret, ignored the wound and continued firing at the Japanese destroyers despite blood running. Into his shoe. At 11:11 p.m., range 5,000 yards, the Japanese formation secondary batteries joined the firing. The battleship Yamashiro's 14 6-inch guns, designed for medium-range combat against cruisers, engaged the PT boats with rapid fire. The 6-inch guns fired 100-pound shells at approximately 8 rounds per gun per minute, creating a curtain of fire through which the PT boats had to navigate. The shells, while smaller than the 14-inch main battery weapons, were far more numerous and had higher hit probability against small, fast targets. The ocean around the PT boats became a forest of waterspouts, shells impacting every few seconds. the explosions creating a constant roar punctuated by the sharper crack of shells passing overhead. The psychological effect was overwhelming. Motor Machinist's Mate First Class Robert Harris in PT-137's engine room, monitoring the 3 roaring Packard engines, later described, "You can't see what's happening. You're below deck with 3 screaming engines, feeling every impact through the hull, knowing shells are landing around you but unable to see them. Every impact, you wonder if that's the one that hit us. The waiting is worse than the explosions." At 11:13 p.m., range 3,000 yards, the Japanese battleship Yamashiro illuminated the PT boats with massive searchlights. The lights, 36-inch diameter carbon arc searchlights normally used for signaling and night battle illumination, created beams powerful enough to blind pilots at 10,000 yards. Pointed directly at the PT boats from 3,000 yards, the lights were devastating. McElfresh, looking directly into the beam, was instantly blinded, his night vision destroyed by the intense light. He turned away, shielding his eyes, relying on his quartermaster to steer while his vision recovered. The sudden illumination turned night into day and exposed every detail of the PT boats to Japanese gunners. The boats, previously dark shapes barely visible against the darker background of the Philippine Islands, became fully visible targets. Machine guns opened fire immediately, the tracers visible as streams of glowing projectiles arcing across the water. Japanese 25mm anti-aircraft guns, ineffective against aircraft but devastating against surface targets at close range, fired in coordinated groups, creating intersecting streams of fire that the PT boats had to navigate. PT-191, commanded by Lieutenant Albert Gage, was caught in a searchlight beam and immediately became the focus of concentrated fire. Gage ordered emergency evasive maneuvers, the boat heeling hard over in maximum rate turn, attempting to exit the light beam, but the searchlight tracked the boat, the operator maintaining illumination despite the boat's maneuvers. Multiple guns fired at the illuminated target. At 11:14 p.m. and 37 seconds, a 6-inch shell from Yamashiro's secondary battery struck PT-191 amidships on the starboard side, approximately 3 feet above the waterline. The shell's 100-pound high-explosive projectile penetrated the 3 to 4-inch plywood hull without difficulty and detonated inside the engine room, where the fuse detected sufficient resistance to trigger. The explosion was catastrophic for the wooden boat. The detonation occurred between the 3 Packard engines, the blast fragmenting the engine blocks and rupturing all 3 fuel tanks simultaneously. High-octane aviation gasoline, stored in tanks containing approximately 3,000 gallons total, sprayed into the engine room, where hot metal fragments ignited it immediately. The resulting fireball consumed the entire midship section of the boat in seconds. Motor Machinist's Mate, Second Class James Holloway, in the engine room when the shell hit, was killed instantly by the explosion. His body never recovered. Motor Machinist's Mate, Third Class Robert Thompson and Fireman First Class Charles Anderson, also in the engine room, died within seconds from burns and blast trauma. The 3 engine men had no chance of survival. The explosion occurred within feet of their positions, and the subsequent fire made the compartment immediately untenable. On deck, the explosion threw Lieutenant Gage and 5 crew members into the water. Gage, standing on the bridge, was lifted by the blast and thrown approximately 20 feet from the boat, landing in the water, stunned but alive. Torpedo Man Second Class Frank Morrison, manning the aft .50 caliber gun, was blown overboard by the blast wave, his life jacket automatically inflating when he hit the water. The survivors swam away from the burning wreckage as ammunition began cooking off, the .50 caliber rounds detonating from heat and creating additional explosions. The burning boat, now a brilliant light source visible for miles, continued drifting north, carried by current and momentum. The fire spread to the wooden deck and superstructure, the dried mahogany burning fiercely. Within minutes, the boat was completely engulfed, flames reaching 30 feet. Into the air, Japanese gunners ceased firing at the wreck. It was clearly destroyed and no longer a threat. The 6 survivors treaded water, watching their boat burn, knowing rescue wouldn't come until the battle concluded hours later. The remaining 3 boats continued their attack run despite the loss. PT-191's destruction, while horrifying, actually provided tactical advantage. The burning wreck drew Japanese attention and fire, allowing the other boats to approach with slightly reduced defensive fire directed at them. McElfresh recognized this grimly. His shipmate's death was buying him seconds to close within torpedo range. At 11:15 p.m., range 1,500 yards from the leading Japanese destroyer and approximately 2,200 yards from battleship Yamashiro, McElfresh judged conditions optimal for torpedo launch. The geometry was imperfect. They were attacking from ahead of the Japanese column rather than the preferred beam angle. But the close range compensated for the poor geometry. At 1,500 yards, torpedo run time would be approximately 90 seconds, giving Japanese ships minimal time to maneuver after torpedo launch was detected. McElfresh ordered, "Standby torpedoes, target battleship center, full spread." The torpedo man's mate. Second Class Eugene Carter, positioned at the torpedo control station amidships, acknowledged and prepared to release all 4 Mark 8 torpedoes in rapid sequence. The torpedoes, each 21 feet long and weighing 3,000 pounds with 600-pound TNT warheads, sat on roll-off racks angled slightly outward to provide spread pattern. McElfresh calculated the firing solution mentally, estimating Japanese formation, speed at 18 knots, course north-northwest, PT-137 speed, 38 knots on converging course. The torpedoes would be fired at the battleship's estimated future position, accounting for both ships' movement during torpedo run time. The calculation was imprecise. PT boat fire control consisted of the commander's judgment, a stopwatch, and estimated ranges from radar, but precision was less important than volume of fire. At 11:15 p.m. and 23 seconds, McElfresh ordered, "Fire torpedoes!" Carter triggered the release mechanism, the first torpedo rolling off its rack and splashing into the water, the impact creating a large splash visible as white water against the dark ocean. The torpedo's engine started immediately, propeller spinning up to drive the weapon at 27 knots toward the target. 1 second later, the second torpedo launched, then the third, then the fourth. 4 torpedoes in 4 seconds, each leaving a distinct white wake as it accelerated away from PT-137 toward the Japanese formation. The torpedoes spread slightly as they traveled, the outward-angled racks creating diverging paths that would bracket the target. If the firing solution was correct, at least 1 or 2 torpedoes should pass close enough to the battleship to hit. If the solution was wrong, all 4 would miss. There was no way to guide them. And after launch, once the torpedoes were in the water, physics and luck determined the outcome. PT-134, running 500 yards to McElfresh's left, launched its 4 torpedoes simultaneously. PT-152, 500 yards to the right, followed 3 seconds later. 12 torpedoes total, 7,200 pounds of TNT, streaked toward the Japanese formation on converging courses. The white wakes, visible in the moonlight and searchlight beams, created a fan pattern spreading across the water. Japanese lookouts spotted the torpedo wakes immediately. Alarms sounded throughout the formation. Battleship Yamashiro's captain ordered emergency turn to starboard, attempting to present the ship's narrow bow to the torpedoes rather than the vulnerable broadside. But battleships don't turn quickly. Yamashiro needed approximately 60 seconds to begin turning and another 30 seconds to complete a 45-degree course change. The torpedoes would arrive before the turn was complete. McElfresh ordered hard starboard turn immediately. After launching, PT-137's bow swinging right as the boat continued at maximum speed. The turn was violent, executed at 38 knots with full rudder deflection. The boat heeled over sharply, the starboard side dipping toward the water as centrifugal force pushed everyone to port. McElfresh grabbed the compass pedestal to maintain his footing. Quartermaster Kovar gripped the helm, fighting the wheel as water pressure on the rudder created enormous resistance. The turn, while necessary for escape, momentarily reduced the boat's speed from 38 to approximately 32 knots as the hull dragged sideways through the water. For critical seconds, PT-137 was slower and more vulnerable. Japanese gunners, tracking the boat, fired intensively at the turning target. A 5-inch shell landed 15 yards to port, the explosion showering the boat with water and shell fragments. Fragments peppered the plywood hull, dozens of small holes appearing in the thin wood. One fragment struck Radio Man, Second Class Thomas. Burke in the shoulder, penetrating his life jacket and lodging in muscle. Burke collapsed, bleeding, but remained conscious. As the turn completed and PT-137 steadied on escape course heading northwest away from the Japanese formation, McElfresh assessed damage while simultaneously watching for torpedo hits. The boat was still capable of 35 knots despite the fragment holes. None had penetrated below the waterline significantly enough to affect buoyancy or create dangerous flooding. One crew member, wounded but functional, engines running normally. They would survive if they could reach darkness before Japanese gunners scored a solid hit. Machine gun fire from the Japanese formation followed the boat, tracers passing overhead and splashing into the water alongside. The Japanese 25mm guns had effective range of approximately 3,000 yards. PT-137 was exiting that range as it accelerated away, but the first few seconds of the escape run were still vulnerable. McElfresh ordered the aft, all 50 caliber gunner to return fire, not expecting to hit anything at that range, but hoping to disrupt Japanese gunners' aim with suppressive fire. Seaman First Class Anthony Rossi, manning the aft twin .50 caliber mount, opened fire, the heavy machine guns hammering out rounds at 800 rounds per minute combined. The tracers arced back toward the Japanese formation, the visible rounds creating the illusion of accurate fire, though Rossi was firing blind at a target 2,000 yards away. But the psychological effect mattered. Japanese gunners seeing incoming tracers would duck or hesitate, degrading their aim even if the incoming fire was inaccurate. At 11:17 p.m., as PT-137 reached 3,500 yards range and relative safety in darkness beyond effective searchlight illumination, McElfresh saw a massive explosion aboard battleship Fuso. A column of water and fire erupted from the battleship's port side amidships, approximately where the engineering spaces would be located. The explosion was far larger than the 600-pound TNT warhead would create alone, suggesting secondary explosions, probably fuel bunkers or ammunition storage sympathetically detonating from the torpedo hit. Fuso staggered, visible even at distance as the battleship's bow dipped and stern rose slightly, the ship's forward motion checking as flooding disrupted buoyancy. Damage control alarms would be sounding throughout the ship, crew racing to contain flooding, pumps working to remove water, watertight doors slamming shut to isolate damaged compartments. The hit wasn't immediately fatal. Fuso remained afloat and under power, but the damage was significant. McElfresh couldn't know which torpedo had hit or which boat had fired it. The 12 torpedoes from 3 boats arrived within seconds of each other, creating overlapping attack that made attribution impossible. But one torpedo had found its target despite poor attack geometry and Japanese evasive maneuvers. The hit validated the attack despite horrific cost. PT-191 destroyed, 6 crew in the water, 12 men engaged in desperate attack against overwhelming force, and 1 torpedo hit achieved. Over the next hour, additional PT boat sections conducted similar attacks against the advancing Japanese force. The attacks followed a pattern: high-speed approach from various angles attempting to achieve surprise, Japanese defensive fire increasing as gunners became more practiced at tracking the small boats, torpedo launches from ranges between 1,000 and 2,500 yards, then desperate high-speed escapes through concentrated fire. Each attack disrupted Japanese formation and forced evasive maneuvers that delayed the advance. PT Boat Section 1, consisting of PT-130, PT-131, and PT-145, attacked at 11:43 p.m. from the western flank. These boats approached from the Philippine Islands coastline, using the dark background to mask their approach until the final sprint. The section commander, Lieutenant Robert Leeson aboard PT-130, timed the attack to coincide with a gap in Japanese searchlight coverage when the lights were focused on Section 3's retreating boats. The approach was successful initially. PT boats closed to 2,000 yards before being detected, but Japanese radar operators, now fully alert after the previous attack, detected the boats despite the darkness. Destroyers on the formation's western flank turned toward the threat, bringing their 5-inch guns to bear. The destroyer Shigure, positioned as western screen, opened fire at 1,800 yards, close enough that the shells arrived with minimal warning. PT-131, commanded by Ensign Peter Hart, took multiple fragment hits during the approach. A 5-inch shell burst 40 feet to starboard, fragments penetrating the plywood hull in a dozen places, some passing completely through the 3-4-inch wood and exiting the port side. Engineman Second Class Vincent Marconi, in the engine room, was struck in the back by a fragment that penetrated his life jacket and lodged near his spine. He collapsed but remained conscious, gasping instructions to the other enginemen to keep the engines running while he lay on the deck unable to move. Despite the damage, PT-131 completed its attack run, launching 4 torpedoes at battleship Yamashiro from 1,200 yards range before turning away. The torpedoes missed. Yamashiro's earlier turn to avoid Section 3's torpedoes had changed the battleship's position enough that Hart's firing solution was inaccurate. The 4 torpedoes passed astern of the battleship, running into open water before their fuel expired and they sank. PT-130 and PT-145 launched their torpedoes simultaneously, 8 additional weapons streaking toward the Japanese formation. The volume of torpedoes forced the Japanese destroyers to maneuver evasively, breaking formation and temporarily creating gaps in the screening pattern. But none of the torpedoes hit capital ships. 1 torpedo struck the destroyer Yamagumo amidships, the explosion breaking the destroyer's back and flooding the engine room. Yamagumo lost power and steering, drifting to a halt while damage control teams attempted to contain flooding. The destroyer would eventually sink from progressive flooding, but this occurred hours later after the main battle concluded. The torpedo hit on Yamagumo, while tactically insignificant compared to hitting a battleship, had strategic effects. The destroyer's distress forced another destroyer, Asagumo, to stand by for rescue operations, removing 2 destroyers from the formation's screening force. This reduced the defensive fire available against subsequent PT boat attacks and weakened the formation's anti-submarine defense. At 12:17 a.m., PT Boat Section 2, consisting of PT-146, PT-150, and PT-151, conducted a coordinated attack from the eastern flank. This section approached at higher speed, 40 knots, attempting to minimize exposure time to Japanese defensive fire. The high-speed approach was successful in reducing time under fire, but created control problems. At 40 knots in combat conditions, the boats were difficult to steer precisely, and formation cohesion degraded as individual boats bounced across wavetops on independent paths. PT-146, commanded by Lieutenant James Harrell, misjudged the approach angle and found itself heading directly toward battleship Fuso's bow rather than broadside. This was the worst possible attack geometry. Torpedoes fired from ahead or astern gave targets maximum time to maneuver by simply changing speed. But Harrell was committed to the attack and too close to abort. He ordered torpedo launch at 1,400 yards, firing all 4 torpedoes directly at Fuso's bow in hopes that at least one might hit before the battleship could accelerate or decelerate to avoid them. Fuso, already damaged from the earlier torpedo hit, was operating at reduced speed and had limited maneuverability. The battleship's captain ordered emergency full speed to outrun the torpedoes, the engineering spaces responding by increasing boiler output to maximum. But the earlier flooding had damaged steam lines, reducing available power. Fuso accelerated from 16 knots to only 19 knots, insufficient to outrun torpedoes traveling at 27 knots. One of PT-146's torpedoes struck Fuso forward, near the bow, at 12:19 a.m. The hit was poorly positioned from a damage standpoint. The bow compartments contained mostly void spaces and crew quarters rather than critical machinery or magazines. But the second torpedo, hit on an already damaged ship, compounded the flooding. Water entering through 2 separate hull breaches stressed Fuso's pumping capacity beyond limits. The battleship began settling by the bow, listing slightly to port as asymmetric flooding affected trim. Fuso's damage control teams fought to save the ship, but the cumulative damage from 2 torpedo hits plus earlier depth charge damage from American submarines, unconfirmed but suspected based on underwater explosion reports earlier in the evening, overwhelmed their efforts. The battleship's captain, realizing the ship was mortally wounded, ordered reduced speed to 12 knots to minimize stress on the damaged hull while damage control continued. This speed reduction had cascading effects on the formation. The flagship Yamashiro and cruiser Mogami maintained 18 knots, gradually pulling ahead of the damaged Fuso. The formation, designed to operate as cohesive unit with battleships providing mutual fire support, began fragmenting as speed differentials separated the ships. The destroyers, attempting to maintain screening positions, were forced to choose between staying with Fuso or advancing with Yamashiro. 2 destroyers remained with Fuso, while the others continued with the main body. By 12:30 a.m., the Japanese Southern Force was no longer a coordinated formation, but a strung-out column of ships separated by several miles, damaged vessels falling behind, escorts scattered between multiple principals. The force's combat power, while still formidable, was degraded by lack of coordination and reduced ability to concentrate fire. At the northern end of Surigao Strait, Rear Admiral Oldendorf had positioned his 6 battleships in line across the strait, forming a T where the Japanese column would emerge directly into concentrated American fire. The battleships, Pennsylvania, California, Tennessee, West Virginia, Maryland, and Mississippi, the first 5 being Pearl Harbor survivors, waited in firing position with all guns trained south, radar tracking the approaching Japanese force, fire control solutions calculated and ready. The 47-minute delay caused by PT boat attacks meant the Japanese emerged into the American battleship line at 3:16 a.m. rather than the planned 2:29 a.m. The additional time allowed American destroyers to complete their torpedo attacks before the battleship engagement began, and ensured that American battleships were in optimal firing position when the Japanese arrived. The Battle of Surigao Strait, when it commenced at 3:16 a.m., was completely one-sided. American battleships firing from prepared positions against Japanese ships that emerged one at a time into a killing zone. The battle lasted approximately 40 minutes. American battleships and cruisers fired approximately 4,000 shells, achieving hundreds of hits on the Japanese vessels. Battleship Yamashiro was sunk with all hands, including Admiral Nishimura. Battleship Fuso, already damaged by the PT boat torpedo hit, was overwhelmed by battleship fire and sank in 2 sections. Cruiser Mogami was crippled and later sunk by aircraft. Of the 4 destroyers, 3 were sunk and 1 escaped damaged. Of approximately 4,000 Japanese personnel in the Southern Force, fewer than 500 survived. The PT boat's contribution was tactical delay rather than physical destruction. The 1 confirmed torpedo hit on Fuso and possible hits on cruisers represented minimal damage to a force that size. But the 47-minute delay was strategically crucial, allowing American forces to achieve perfect positioning for the ambush. Post-battle analysis by American naval staff concluded PT boat attacks in Surigao Strait achieved minimal direct damage but caused significant tactical delay through forced evasive maneuvers. The delay allowed optimal positioning of American battleship force and contributed to the complete destruction of Japanese Southern Force. PT boat losses of 2 boats and 11 personnel were acceptable relative to strategic outcome achieved. The broader Battle of Leyte Gulf ended in decisive American victory across all 4 engagements. The Japanese Navy lost 4 aircraft carriers, 3 battleships, 10 cruisers, and 9 destroyers, approximately 300,000 tons of shipping destroyed. American losses were minimal: 1 light carrier, 2 escort carriers, 2 destroyers, and 1 destroyer escort. The battle effectively destroyed the Japanese Navy as a fighting force, ending any possibility of Japanese naval operations threatening American advances. The PT boat engagement at Surigao Strait demonstrated the tactical principle that small, fast platforms could achieve strategic effects against much larger forces through harassment and delay, even when direct damage was minimal. The 7 PT boats couldn't sink battleships with torpedo attacks, but they could delay them long enough for forces that could sink battleships to prepare. The plywood boats served their design purpose: early warning, harassment, and tactical delay, accepting casualties to achieve mission objectives. The human cost was significant relative to the small forces involved. Of 13 PT boats engaged, 1 was sunk with 6 crew killed, 2 were damaged beyond repair with 4 crew wounded, and the others sustained various degrees of damage. Total casualties: 11 dead, 7 wounded, 3 boats destroyed or written off. These losses, while small in absolute numbers, represented approximately 15% of the force engaged and approximately 8% of personnel casualties. The tactical lessons were incorporated into post-war naval doctrine. Small, fast attack craft armed with torpedoes or missiles could achieve disproportionate effects against larger forces when employed correctly. Modern navies employ similar concepts with fast attack craft, missile boats, and submarines that use speed, stealth, and standoff weapons to threaten capital ships. The PT boats at Surigao Strait demonstrated the principle's validity despite the enormous disparity in size, firepower, and survivability. October 24, 1944, was when 7 PT boats detected the Japanese Southern Force entering Surigao Strait. 10:36 p.m. was when PT-137's radar detected battleship-sized contacts at 18,000 yards. 11:07 p.m. was when the first attack run began against overwhelming firepower. 11:14 p.m. was when PT-191 was destroyed by 6-inch shell hit. 11:17 p.m. was when a torpedo hit. Battleship Fuso, the only confirmed PT boat success of the engagement. Midnight was when the attacks concluded after 47 minutes of delay inflicted on the Japanese advance. 3:16 a.m. was when American battleships opened fire on the delayed Japanese force. 4 a.m. was when the Japanese Southern Force ceased to exist. 7 boats totaling 392 tons, 28 torpedoes, 12 men per boat, against 4 battleships and 8 cruisers totaling 137,000 tons, 150 major caliber guns, 4,000 men, proved that mass and firepower don't determine outcomes when timing and tactics are properly applied, and that sometimes delaying the enemy is more important than destroying them. Not because the plywood boats could sink the battleships, because they could delay them long enough for forces that could. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe. Your support preserves these histories of small forces achieving strategic effects. Tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We honor those who faced impossible odds to buy time for others. Thank you for keeping their stories alive.